All right, we are going to talk about epistemology. So, what exactly do we mean by this term? Generally speaking, the word means the study of knowledge. And so that's going to be the issue we're going to consider. What exactly is the nature of knowledge? What do we mean by this term? What does this concept apply to, right? How do we know anything at all? How do we know anything with certainty? And that's in turn going to lead us to discussions of skepticism. In what way might we be wrong about what we take ourselves to know? Right? How do we know what we know is really what we know? These are going to be the issues we're going to talk about now. So let's go back to Socrates, who was a Greek philosopher living between 470 to 399 before the Common Era. Socrates was one of the most influential and most important philosophers in the Western society. He never really wrote anything down, but everything that we know from Socrates, what we know about him, what we know from his teachings, comes from Plato. Plato was a pupil of Socrates who lived generally from 427 to 347 before the Common Era. And so what happened with Socrates and Plato was Socrates would go from village to village, from person to person, asking deep, probing questions. Questions like, what is the nature of justice? What is virtue? What is knowledge? What is truth? He would ask these deep questions, and when people tried to give an answer, he would try to then show that whatever they took themselves to, to know was problematic in some way. So somebody might say justice just is giving to others what you owe them, and Socrates would attempt to show that this is not a sufficient way of thinking about that concept. This is not going to count for justice. Virtue might be thought of as, obeying or respecting the gods, but Socrates might go and try to show how virtue is not necessarily, always going to count as respecting the gods, or maybe counterexamples to that sort of definition of virtue. And so he would do the same thing for all these different concepts. And so Plato recorded these sort of conversations that Socrates would have. And these conversations were an attempt to show that that whatever we take our concept to be was inadequate, right? So Plato tells us that really knowledge is something deeper than merely having some opinion or some belief. In fact, Plato talks about how knowledge is tied down, right? It's supposed to be lasting and stable. So merely having a belief or having some opinion that turns out to be true is not going to be good enough. Think about this in terms of like a map versus knowing exactly where somebody lives, right? Somebody might give you directions to their house, and they might tell you to take, some particular highway or some particular road. And so you might draw that out on a map. And it might be true, right? That might be a true opinion or true belief on how to get to that person's house. But in some situations, the road could be closed, or there may be some other reason why those particular directions are not going to work in that situation. And so without, having knowledge of how to get to that person's house, without understanding where they live, you'll be, stuck, right? Because the map, the mere true opinion that you have is not going to be adequate in that situation. Whereas if you truly do understand how to get to that person's house, you can get there without the map. So if there's road closures, you'll know how to get there without using those roads. That's just a very, very sort of general example. It's a toy example of how you might have true opinion or true belief, but this is not going to count as knowledge, right? So Plato and Socrates thought of knowledge as being stable. It was certain. It was going to give us true understanding, not merely having a true opinion or true belief, right? So this means that knowledge requires the following sorts of ingredients. It definitely needs to involve a belief, according to this view of knowledge, the belief that P, where P is any sort of proposition, where a proposition itself is a truth-apt sentence or a truth-apt claim of some form. It has to be truth-apt in order for it to be true, right? Because only a truth-apt claim is either true or false, right? So knowledge of this view on this view requires a belief that a belief towards the truth of some proposition. It also requires that that proposition is in fact true. So if you believe that it's raining outside right now, and it turns out that it's not raining outside right now, then that belief is false. And so you don't have knowledge in that case. But if you do believe that it's raining outside and it really, in fact, is raining outside, that proposition turns out to be true, well, then you may, in this case, have knowledge. So the proposition in question has to be true. So with regard to the issue of whether it's raining outside, the proposition just would be, it's raining outside. And if that's true, then you may have knowledge. But you need one other thing, and that's justification, right? So you need to be justified in believing that P. So maybe you are outside and you're standing in the rain, and so that's what's going to justify your belief that it's raining. Or maybe you just simply look out the window, or you can hear the rain hitting the roof. All right, there may be lots of different ways in which your belief is justified. But the thing is that it needs to be justified. Think about a courtroom sort of example to help make this point clear. Right. So if a defendant is on trial and there's an expert witness that takes the stand, and the prosecutor says, "Well, how do you know that the defendant is guilty?" And the witness says, "Well, it was just a good guess." Well, in that particular case, the witness may have a belief that the defendant is guilty, and that belief may in fact be true, but it doesn't seem to be justified. If he's just takes a good guess, he just got lucky, well, then it's not going to be justified, and we would say that witness's testimony should not count. But if we say, if we ask the witness and the witness says, "I was in the room, I saw him do it," or, we've got DNA evidence or something like along these lines, well, then it looks like the witness might have a belief that is justified in that particular sort of case. Right. So we need these three sorts of ingredients. These three conditions need to be satisfied in order to have knowledge, according to this ancient tradition going back to Socrates and Plato. And that's a belief that is true, and that belief is justified. And this is what we call the JTB account of knowledge. JTB just means the justified true belief account. Now, it turns out that contemporary philosophers will argue that these three conditions are not sufficient. We need something else. They may be necessary, right? They're required, but many contemporary philosophers will argue that we need other sorts of conditions in addition to these. We're not going to get into that issue for this class, but in order to really get a better understanding of how skepticism works, it's helpful to think about it as this JTB account of knowledge in the background. Having that in the background is going to be helpful for our purposes.